understand you've kind of been just focused on helping a lot of local communities lately in the aftermath of the hurricane, right?
Yeah, so that's absolutely what we've been doing. We've basically been, because we cover 9 counties with the 7th Congressional District.
Yeah.
So we've essentially tried to get out to every community that was hit hard by Florence and make sure that we got to distribution centers, that we got to the shelters, and that we really made sure that we hit the hardest hit areas.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What would you say, like, some of your biggest takeaways from that experience, or from really firsthand seeing the aftermath of the hurricane?
I tell you, the worst thing has been that there were people that were the hardest hit by Matthew, which was 2 years ago now, that essentially never recovered from Matthew and then got hit again with utter devastation. And it's really, speaking as a candidate and as someone who really wants to make a difference in the public health, it's devastating that people have been hit now this time with basically a toxic sludge that's flooding their homes.
Absolutely.
With it's a mix of hog waste and coal ash, and then we had several wastewater treatment plants overflow. And so it's been a public health crisis really from day one since Florence hit, that people have been dealing with and standing in these toxic floodwaters.
Jeez, yeah. Yeah, I've done a little bit of reading about this, including Smithfield, like the area you said that got hit again since Hurricane Matthew very badly. From my understanding, the hog waste spilled over from lagoons that are on low flood plain areas, correct?
That's right. And basically what's happened is that, you know, for generations, we had hog and poultry farms in North Carolina without significant issues. But now we've turned farming into basically a factory operation. And many of these companies are now multinational corporations, in many cases that are being run out of China.
Yes, yeah.
And they have abandoned what we know to be the most effective ways to manage waste. And so they placed all of the risk onto small family farmers to manage waste and basically risk their livelihoods if they don't do what they tell them to do. And so what's ended up happening is that we have farmers that are placed at risk for their livelihoods unnecessarily.
Yes.
And then every time that we have a storm, these hog lagoons are fundamentally at risk of overflowing. And then this has become a public health crisis, as, you know, the Neuse River and the Cape Fear River in particular were affected in this crisis.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, and also from what I understand, Smithfield has the capacity to upgrade their infrastructure to protect against these kind of extreme disasters, but has opted not to. And
that's
exactly
right. The larger corporations basically contract out raising the animals, and that's why it's such a big ordeal, is that these larger corporations could absolutely afford to manage the waste effectively and keep us healthy, but they are choosing not to. And essentially the U.S. Department of Agriculture has become a department of big ag.
Yes.
And they're not doing what they need to be doing to protect our family farm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to protect the people of Eastern North Carolina.
In large part because the costs for the cleanup come from taxpayer dollars. Like, it's going to come from the public option as well, right?
That's right. So across the board, the cost of cleaning up coal ash is going to fall on the Duke Energy customers instead of these larger corporations. And it's shameful that we shouldn't have to pick up the tab for the biggest polluters.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the reason why with our campaign, we have elected not to take corporate political action committee money and big polluter money, including fossil fuel industry money, because we really want to stand up for everyday North Carolinians.
Absolutely. You know, I think that's one of the most compelling aspects about your campaign, is that due to the fact that you're not constrained by the financial binds of most politicians, you can serve the people with integrity. And I was looking at some of your campaign financing, and I believe it's less than a third of your opponent, the incumbent Representative Dave Rouser, who is largely opposite. Like, most of your funding comes from less than $1,000 donations from, grassroots groups, whereas
Right.
he's largely those exact corporations we're talking about, such as Dow DuPont, I believe.
That's right. It's been he's been hovering around like just over 50 to 60% of his funds have been from corporate political action committees. And then on the flip side, it's been around less than 2% of his actual campaign finances from small dollar individual donations. On the contrary, the vast majority, it's been basically about 70% of our funds have come from inside the 7th Congressional District, and over 90% of our funds are from individual donors.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's also probably a factor, or definitely a factor, that's inhibiting him from taking any action involving Gen X, a contaminant that has been proven with studies with lab animals to be carcinogenic, and it's also linked to, or it's similar to C8, a
That's
chemical
right.
from DuPont. Yeah, he's taken zero action involving that. And
So with Gen X, I mean, what we're seeing is that he took money actually from the DuPont Good Government Fund, which I do recognize that the words DuPont and good government belong nowhere next to each other. But he took their money and then has basically ushered in an agenda of defunding and dismantling the EPA.
Yes.
He introduced a bill that was the Stopping the EPA Overreach Act. And he has been one of those individuals who was most inclined to promote the agenda of big polluters. And as we've seen, as you mentioned, our kids should never be guinea pigs at the hands of a Fortune 500 polluter.
Absolutely.
That's essentially what's happened. At DuPont, as they were dumping Gen X, that you recognize is probably a carcinogen because it's so closely related to C8, that we do not have good standards to test individuals or to verify that that they are safe. We don't know as doctors how to effectively protect people from our contaminated water. And the reason that we don't know is because individuals like my opponent have basically attempted to defund and dismantle the EPA and undo any common sense regulations against these corporate polluters. And if you didn't realize, so DuPont, after they dump, they're also one of the leading manufacturers of reverse osmosis filtration systems.
Yes.
Which means that they profit on the one system that will actually clean up your water after they dump.
Wow. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. What would be some of the policy action that you would strive to implement to combat these kind of corporate loopholes, or the efforts to make these tiny differences in chemicals before they have been properly regulated to continue toxifying our drinking water supplies?
Well, some of the key things that we need to do is that we need to basically empower the public health side through the CDC. And so a lot of folks don't realize the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, has an environmental public health tracking network. And part of what they are set to do is actually study the effects of emerging contaminants like Gen X and enable individuals in the community to report what they've been exposed to and what concerns that they have. So basically, you're enabling the public and providers to be able to report accountability and transparency. So I think that's several of the key things that need to happen. We need to empower the CDC to deal with these emerging contaminants and pollutants. The EPA is funded and has the team.
You're breaking up just a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
And that last part. No, it was gold. Please keep
Yeah,
going.
we need to enable the EPA and empower them to crack down on these big polluters.
Yes.
And then, as a third point, we need to make sure that people have the teeth and the technology to be able to enforce whatever standards are put in place by the EPA, which means that the EPA needs to be able to work closely with county public health departments and with the state departments of environmental quality to enforce the standards that are set. And one of the things I do want to highlight that a lot of reporters have not picked up on is the same class of chemicals. It's PFOAs versus PFOSs.
Mm-hmm.
PFOSs that are very closely akin to Gen X, they've been found in very high levels from firefighting foam that the DoD uses. So then they have found high levels of PFOSs around the Air Force Base that's in our district as well.
Yeah.
So this is going to be an issue that, these potential cancer-causing agents are next to a large number. I think it was 126 at last count, Department of Defense installations.
It's so, jeez. Yeah. Well, it's nice to hear your level of policy knowledge concerning this issue, because it's a multifaceted thing. It's difficult to combat. And
absolutely.
Continuing on kind of the assault on science, another kind of shocking fact is the legislation that was passed in 2012 concerning sea level rise and coastal development.
Right.
In District 7. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as you probably recognize, my opponent was one of the primary sponsors in the state Senate of the bill that banned consideration of accelerated sea level rise and planning. And as you recognize, when we don't accept the scientific reality of climate change and when we don't plan appropriately, what happens is that it costs us billions as taxpayers in cleanup after storms, because properties are, inappropriately located in floodplains. Coastal property is highly lucrative, and it's likely to be damaged.
Absolutely.
We need to use the best scientific evidence that we have available, and instead, my opponent has chosen to put the Koch brothers and an anti-science agenda first. And it has everything to do with him taking a bunch of money to fund his campaign from the oil and gas industry.
Yes, I mean, it's painful.
And he's to the tune of it's over $90,000, I think he's got in his career to fund his campaigns from oil and gas. And if you didn't pull up for fun, you should pull up. Stephen Colbert did a segment back when he did the Colbert Report that he called it equals MC scared. If you do the Colbert Report sink or swim, he made fun of us denying the scientific reality of climate change in a fun way. But on a serious note, I think it's really critical that we elect leaders in this next Congress who understand the scientific reality of climate change and who also will protect our coast, because as you recognize, the Atlantic coast has now been opened up to offshore drilling. Mm-hmm. And my opponent is one of the only coastal reps, Republican or Democrat, who is pro-drilling. And that would risk our economy. There's roughly 95 billion in GDP and 1.4 million jobs in clean industries like fishing, recreation, and tourism that would be at risk with Atlantic offshore drilling.
Yes. Yeah, it's clearly profit over people over there. And I mean, I think it's awesome how clearly your background as a physician, and you also have an MBA, so I mean, you're coming at it with a real empirical, rational perspective that is also founded on real life experience and compassion. I mean, as I understand, the detrimental effects of environmental degradation have severely impacted your personal life, correct? I was reading about how you lost a family member in the deep Water Horizon explosion.
We did, and Dewey was one of the 11 people killed in that catastrophic explosion. And unfortunately, he never got to meet his grandchildren. He never got to walk his youngest daughter down the aisle for wedding because of what happened on that fateful day. And as you and many of us recognize, there were several points at which EP could have stepped up for the safety of workers that have been called the well from hell, that it was causing them problems with high pressure readings throughout the time that they were drilling. And so it's important that people know that at the time that Dewey died, oil and gas workers were 7 times more likely to die on the job than other U.S. workers.
Jeez.
And just this past week, the Trump administration rolled back the rest of the safety regulations that were put in place after the Deepwater Horizon. And one of the things that they rolled back was requiring third-party inspections on safety measures and basic safety equipment on these offshore oil platforms. Do you trust the oil and gas industry to actually inspect and regulate itself? If not, we need to elect a new generation of leaders who will hold these polluting industries accountable.
Absolutely.
And protect the safety of workers.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's clearly obvious with your level of policy knowledge that you'd be a great fighter for the environment. But I think another thing that makes you interesting and unique is your background with veterans, because I think a lot of politicians kind of try to vicariously take on the honor and bravery of veterans without actually striving to take care of them and looking at the unique struggles they face. And like, I know that one of the main motivating factors in getting you involved in this was to try to take care of veterans, right?
That's absolutely right. So I worked as a VA physician, and was one of the big factors when I looked at where I wanted to train to become a doctor and residency program, that I wanted to care for veterans. And part of that was because my dad lost his older brother 8 weeks after returning from Vietnam. And I think the notion of losing veterans stateside after they've returned from combat and when they're supposed to be safe at home, the unfairness of that stuck with me my entire life.
Yeah.
So then as I was working as a VA doctor, unfortunately, I near tragically lost patients to suicide and almost lost other ones to delays in routine medical care. And so that came back to me and came home to me that this was going to continue to happen, that we were going to lose veterans stateside if we didn't make a substantive difference in how we take care of our veterans.
Yes.
And so I had been with my MD and MBA. I was talking to administration because I care about improving healthcare systems and cutting through the bureaucracy and red tape to really reform the VA. And finally, one day, my boss said, well, I don't know what to tell you, Kyle. It's going to take an act of Congress to fix the VA. and then I just became, in my heart, I became set on getting an act of Congress. And so, as you probably recognize, I worked on veteran suicide prevention.
Yes. Yeah.
I worked on opiate safety related to veterans. And then I worked on some toxic exposures because, like, for example, one of my veterans that attempted suicide, his dad that he wanted me to meet was near tragically lost after a misdiagnosis from Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And we're doing the same thing with young veterans have been exposed to burn pits in the Middle East. And that has not been a service-connected condition, even though we've seen pancreatic and then swallowing pipe esophageal cancers in young veterans exposed to burn pits. And so these are issues that are fundamental to who we are as patriots and Americans. And unlike my opponent, I understand that being a patriot and an American is about more than flag pins and photo ops and parades. It's about policies that really lift up and take care of our veterans.
Yes.
Because we have a sacred obligation to those who bravely serve this country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And from that experience in the VA as physician, I think you come with a deep kind of comprehensive understanding of America's healthcare system and its serious issues. We spend far more than any other developed country, yet don't provide coverage to all of our citizens, and prescription drugs are continuously to skyrocket in price. So, what would you identify as kind of some of the broadest issues concerning national healthcare and how we can improve them?
Many of us recognize that every American deserves the right to quality health care, that health care should be a basic right in this country and not just a privilege and luxury for the few.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, though, while every other developed country in the world basically recognizes this and they set up a safety net to ensure that those who are struggling, who are the most vulnerable, whether that's seniors or kids or those struggling with an opiate addiction, they make sure that they can get basic health care without tremendous cost.
Yeah.
But in the U.S., we have a lack of attention to the healthcare system, and instead what we have is fragmented systems that work really well for the biggest pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies and their lobbyists, but that do not work well for the average American. And so what I would propose is that we have to rein in the influence of a lot of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, that we really have to put patients for politics.
Absolutely.
And ensure that we invest in Medicare and Medicaid, and we allow those programs to negotiate better drug prices, and that we control costs in healthcare in a way that's accountable and transparent. We're getting the best value that for their healthcare.
Absolutely. Another thing that ties into that you spoke on a little bit before was the opiate crisis, which has seriously impacted District 7 as well as the nation as a whole. And I mean, that's definitely another multifaceted issue that comes from mental health issues that have yet to really be properly understood or appreciated in the public eye, and also corporate malfeasance, like you said, our system is set up to serve the financial interests of pharmaceutical companies before people. Like for one example, I know that Purdue Pharmaceutical lied about the addictive properties of OxyContin to the medical community. Is another issue. Yeah. So can you talk about the opioid crisis a little bit in District 7 and maybe some potential solutions?
Yeah, as you mentioned, so Layton County, even in the 7th Congressional District, Layton County is actually divided, but it is one of the counties where there were roughly there were roughly enough pills for every adult man and woman to have 10 pills.
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
Devastating.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Hearn, I couldn't hear that last 30 seconds or so.
So Wilmington is one of the cities in the U.S. that has had one of the highest rates of reversals, so reversing opiate overdoses to save lives.
Wow.
And we had some of the highest per capita substance abuse rates when it comes to opiates. And I'm happy to send you the studies on this. But basically, know that Eastern North Carolina has been at the center of the opiate crisis. And this is a crisis that drug companies that are...
Sorry, it's breaking up a little bit again.
It might be worse. Let me see if I move, if it gets better.
Hello?
Let's see. Can you hear me a little bit better?
Yeah, I hear you super clear now.
Okay, that's what it was. It was where it was at. So Wilmington has been an area with some of the highest per capita abuse of opiates in the country. And what we know is that the drug companies and manufacturers have poured these highly addictive manufactured drugs into small town America, and that this has perpetuated a crisis. And when it comes to addressing this, I think the key is that we need to make sure that we protect patients who have benefited and need medications for chronic pain, and we protect healthcare providers that are managing chronic pain, but that we make sure that we are not enabling drug companies and manufacturers to make profit out of addiction
Absolutely.
that they do not need. And so what I have proposed, I've worked on the opiate safety legislation, is all about the fact that we will not arrest our way out of addiction. We need to ensure that folks who have a substance abuse get the care and they need. So I care about investing in law enforcement assisted deployment programs. I care about making sure that
It's breaking up a bit again.
Are available to pharmacists and to those who are picking up prescriptions for opiates. And I care about investing in Medicaid. A lot of people don't realize that Medicaid accounts for roughly a quarter of mental health care coverage and a fifth of substance abuse care in this country. So while my opponent has tried to Medicaid, it's critically important in the face of the opiate crisis that we actually invest in Medicaid.
Dr. Horton, sorry, can't hear you.
Yeah.
Well, if that was the last part, no, I totally agree with the Medicaid. That was an excellent point. And often the administrative costs are lower than private insurance.
That's absolutely true. So while a lot of politicians try to tout that we need big-time Medicaid reform, it's important to know that the administrative and overhead costs for Medicare and Medicaid tend to be far lower, and usually as much as even like 60% lower than private insurance companies. So Medicare and Medicaid are highly efficient in comparison to a lot of our private and for-profit insurance options.
Definitely. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, this makes me think of, is the extreme polarization in America that, especially, most evidently clear in like the recent Kavanaugh hearings, and you scroll down Facebook and see the most vicious arguments taking place, but one thing, I believe with your temperament, I know that you will strive for bipartisan solutions while maintaining your integrity. Can you talk about that a little bit, like working across the aisle?
Yeah, it's really important to me. As you know, I've worked with Senator Tillis, for example, on legislation to help veterans who were exposed to burn pits in the Middle East. And I've worked across the aisle on opiate safety for veterans as well. Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina sponsored the Veteran Suicide Prevention Bill that I had worked on, called the Clay Hunt Suicide Prevention for American Veterans Act. So it's really important, I think, to the American people that they understand that the integrity of our democracy relies on people working across the aisle and people trying to and striving for the best possible solutions that are adhere to common sense and adhere to principles of what our country was founded on.
Yes.
What disturbs me nowadays is that the partisan polarization has become basically tribal, and people aren't willing to have conversations across the aisle.
Yes.
How many of us as adults work with people that we don't really like on a daily basis? But we work with them anyway because it's part of being an adult to be civil, to manage and do what's best for the greater good. In many cases, if that's a company, But in Washington, it seems like people end up there and they become entrenched in Washington politics as usual.
Mhm.
That they're concerned more about the lobbyists and the biggest special interests than they are the people of their district. But I think that if we elect a new generation of leaders that I hope to be, that we could actually change the tide in Washington with the aisle who are willing to put the good of people over these big special interests, really stand up for the integrity of our democracy.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that you bring more to the table a desire to serve people than kind of any ideological absolute commitment. Like I think you're actually really looking at policies that work as opposed to a fixation or kind of these ego issues that hold back a lot of politicians. There's two more things I wanted to ask you about. Wilmington specifically. So I was going to ask you about in America, the quality of opportunity often fails to be provided along racial lines. For example, in one of the areas in our district, in my hometown, Wilmington, North Carolina, is the site of the only successful coup d'etat in American history in which white supremacists overthrew a fusionist interracial government and massacred the black community there. And in the aftermath of this, the black community is still impacted by things like redlining, racial gerrymandering, segregated schools, and unequal funding of public schools. While a lot of these co-conspirators from that coup have their names laminated on major buildings throughout Wilmington. And one thing that I also thought you were trying to bring to the table is that equality of opportunity and how we can uplift some of our traditionally most marginalized communities.
Yeah, as you pointed out, the legacy.
Sorry, I can't really.
Yeah, can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah.
Okay. In Wilmington and throughout eastern North Carolina, there's a devastating legacy of segregation, and it's perpetuated itself into modern times that we're at the epicenter of many environmental justice challenges. We're also at the epicenter of challenges with de facto resegregation of our schools, that we have essentially a school to prison pipeline that's perpetuated by suspensions that begin at a very early age for many of our kids. And so it's critically important, I think, that that our leaders recognize that we have to do better in protecting people from the perspective of, basic and fundamental rights for those who are, Black and brown individuals and may not have all the privileges of being a individual of privilege in this country. And so I'm deeply concerned about the fact that if you look at how we've responded to the cocaine epidemic and crisis in comparison to how we've responded to the opiate crisis, there are fundamental differences when the color of the faces affected looks differently. And if you look at what happened in the wake of Maria,
Absolutely.
in Puerto Rico, thousands of individuals died. Can you imagine how the federal response would have been different if that island was called Nantucket and those faces looked different?
Oh, absolutely. I actually volunteered in Puerto Rico for a little over a month.
Did you?
Yeah, and I learned a lot about the colonial history there. Is absolutely shocking. I mean, the level of eugenics. It's actually the only place where America bombed its own soil because of an independence movement there.
Oh my gosh, actually that makes perfect sense, and I never thought about that in a million years, but yeah. I mean, these legacies of segregation and injustice have perpetuated themselves, and it's part of why I've been so proud to be a leader that has spoke up as part of the racial justice movements that we have seen here. And it's because, when you are entrenched in, societal racism or these policies, that impedes your opportunity in the economy. It devastates
Absolutely.
generations of families. And so, there's not a coincidence that some of the hardest hit communities in the wake of Florence are disproportionately minority communities. That's also been the case as we've been looking at the challenges from coal ash contamination and with water contamination, that these huge environmental justice challenges are often disproportionately minority and poor communities. And so I'm committed to being the kind of leader that stands up for opportunity for all.
That's awesome. And it also lends into another thing I wanted to mention, which was perhaps the most disturbing policy of this administration, this presidential administration, has been the separation of undocumented families, and purposely detaining children. I know that in North Carolina, there's a large involvement with that in the agriculture sector. Could you maybe talk about immigration a bit and kind of developing humane policies regarding that?
Yeah, as a physician and someone who understands, public health, I can tell you that separating families is inhumane and cruel. It is something that will devastate people for a lifetime in a way that they will not be able to get over. And it is particularly shameful that in many cases, these were folks that were fleeing violence and oppression and seeking political asylum in this country. And it's been one of our founding principles and values to be a country that's a beacon of democracy and hope. And that is etched in, the Statue of Liberty with the Lazarus poem. Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And so what I, think is critically important for people to recognize is that, common sense immigration policies are part of our founding principles in this country. And they're also part of what makes us great as a country and helps our economy to thrive. So it's important that people know that there was a study done, for example, in the height of the recession, there were roughly over 400,000 unemployed North Carolinians. And there were roughly 6,500 jobs in agriculture that were open. Guess how many U.S. native-born citizens actually finished the growing season and completed that season to work in agriculture? It was only 7.
Oh my gosh.
So agriculture in eastern North Carolina is entirely dependent on migrant worker and immigrant labor. And I recognize this and am committed to, respecting the founding principles of this nation and integrating law-abiding and hardworking immigrants into our economy in a way that promotes growth and respects what we need to be a successful nation and country.
That's awesome. Few last things. I was reading through your AMA, and one thing that you brought up that I really liked on Reddit was about economic access for unprivileged or traditionally marginalized groups. One quote you put from Elizabeth Warren, that we should be taxing students at the same rate as big banks. And you were talking about wage theft a little bit there. Could you maybe comment on the economy as a whole and spreading its fruits to all of our citizens?
Yeah. So as you recognize, what we have is an economy that's worked incredibly well for the wealthiest 1%, and it's leaving hardworking Americans behind. My parents both had manufacturing jobs. Both of them retired from working on the GM factory floor back when there were manufacturing jobs that were an avenue to solidly be in the middle class.
Yeah.
But now what we're seeing is an economy that works really well for those in the risky financial and speculative sides of our economy that leaves the rest of us behind. Mm-hmm. And so as you recognize, there are those who grow up unprivileged who don't have access to, privileged education. And so I don't think that we should be saddling our students with a lifetime of debt just trying to succeed in a 21st century economy. And so I very much am in favor of making sure that 2-year community colleges are free, because let's face it, vocational trade and technical jobs like, plumbers and electricians, solar and wind installation, those are jobs of the 21st century. And if we make a 2-year community college accessible to everyone, then that also lowers the cost for those who choose to go to a 4-year college or get a liberal arts degree. And so I very much believe that education is the bootstrap of opportunity that will enable everyone to lift themselves up. And I also believe, though, that we should have an economy that works for hardworking Americans, and that, we should make sure that we have basic labor rights and protections, and that we are reining in Wall Street to create an economy that doesn't just work for the biggest Wall Street bankers and financial institutions, but that also works for Main Street Americans. Yeah. And so that's part of why I'm deeply concerned about, what happened with the most recent tax bill, that most of that money is not going back into the pockets of workers, but it's going into stock buybacks and dividends.
Absolutely.
So yet again, we are perpetuating the cycle of inequality and making sure that hardworking Americans pay more than their fair share and aren't even being paid a living wage, and that needs to stop.
Absolutely. I think that's all my questions for today. I mean, it's pretty compelling how much policy knowledge you have. I mean, one other thing I wanted to mention was you've reached out to David Rouser for a debate, right? Correct?
We have. So we actually, he has not, to our knowledge, still agreed to a debate or forum. So we have 4 different forums that we have agreed to, that he has not agreed to a single one. He has also not held a single town hall since last year, which was his only town hall in the entire 2-year cycle. As you recognize, though, I have taken a town hall pledge that when we win, and I am the first Congresswoman to represent this district, that I will continue to be accountable and transparent to the people of the 7th Congressional by hosting regular town halls in every district work week. And we will be proudly showing up at all 4 of these forums throughout our district that are going to be covered by our major media without his participation.